Okay. Um, okay, here I am again. It's been a while, partly because I wasn't sure what to say, and also because I wanted to do a screencast and a screen recording, and I couldn't figure out how to use OBS software. But I think I've got it now. So this is part 34, and it's called "What If We Start Listening to and Obeying Our Own Self?" And this was occasioned by and realizing that people that I deal with, they're also negative all the time. They're always it's not so much they're always complaining, but they're they come up with ideas that they would like to try and immediately talk themselves out of it and explain to themselves and to anybody who will listen why it's not going to work or why it's a bad idea. This is before you even try it. They've already assumed that it's a stupid idea, a bad idea. So they don't even try it or wonder why they thought of it in the first place. And I thought it might be useful to examine this idea. Um, so I've got a whole lot of. I'm also doing a screencast because I didn't want to forget the ideas that I thought were useful and important. So I've got this. I'm using a program called Obsidian, and so I've got here various kind of summaries. So look at that magic, right? Just click the little triangle and it opens up. It twirls down. So I initially I was going to call the video "Stop Censoring Yourself" because that's what people do. They've got an idea and they immediately censor themselves and think, well, it's bad, or it's not a good idea, or people are not going to like it, or they give some reason or some excuse why they shouldn't do it. But then I thought, instead of beginning with the negative, like stop doing something, I thought maybe I should call it "Start Listening to Yourself." But then I thought, start listening to it and obeying yourself. What would happen? Would your life improve? To what extent would it improve? Would it be better if we began to pay attention to our own thinking, our own ideas, and did something with them and see where they led rather than assume that it's not going to work? So, point number two is getting in your own way. So, playing with the mouse here. Okay, so how many times a day do we get in our own way? Right? You're thinking of something and you immediately talk yourself out of it, or you censor the idea and think it's not possible, or you decide that you couldn't do it, or we'd obviously fail if we tried. And then I wrote here, is this good? No. Um, Sorry, I've got this magnifier on here. Okay, so um, it's a bad idea to get in your own way, but we do it a lot. We do it all the time, and we're not probably aware of it. So the next point is right and left brain. Part of the problem or part of the solution is to remember the difference between right and left brain functions, because the right brain is creative and it comes up with ideas and makes connections, right? And that's creative. But the left side of the brain is a whole other side of our thinking that's logical and critical and sees flaws and sees problems. And and it's a good idea to keep the two functions separate or to work with them at different times rather than come up with the idea and then immediately critique it. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work well. I mean, it works. You get something, but it's a better idea to keep them separate. So if you're going to do brainstorming about how to solve a problem or how to fix something, come up with a few ideas, leave it for a day, and then go back and look at the answers you came up with later. And then you've got a better chance of making something out of the ideas you came up with. Because if you come up with an idea and immediately critique it, you're going to throw it away because you're going to immediately see what's wrong with it. Whereas if you let your life develop or let things happen and you talk to people and you do other things, then you come back to that idea, you're not going to be as prone to throwing away something that has potential, that could be turned into something good. But if you do it at the time, you're just going to throw it away. So I'm thinking, don't do that. And what you do, I think, is, if I can open this Trello, write it all down. Pay attention to the thoughts that you have and have a notebook somewhere and write down what you're thinking and what you're imagining and what you want and what you don't want. And write it all down, because you personally may think that you're actually quite positive. But I think that if you were to write it all down, you'll discover that you're shutting yourself down all the time, or more than you realize. So I wrote, monitor our thinking, write it down, and assess it tomorrow or the day after you write it down, and not on the same day. Because if you come up with an idea and we're just creating or seeing a connection and critique it at the same time, that's how you get in your own way. So people, in the morning, I want to learn Spanish, right? I think I'd be quite nice. I'd like to be able to speak Spanish. And then in the afternoon, I think I don't have time to learn a language. So what have I done? And I forgot in the morning that I wanted to learn Spanish, or I thought it was a good idea, or it was an interesting possibility. So what I'm doing in the morning, I want one thing, and in the afternoon, I'm telling myself it's not going to work, or I can't have it, or it's just a bad idea. So I'm contradicting myself. But I forgot in the afternoon what I was telling myself in the morning. And that's why that's a lot of the reason why our lives get stuck, or why we feel we can't do anything or achieve anything. And it's because we forgot what we thought we were thinking earlier. So if you write it all down, you've got a better chance of developing a path that we want to travel. That reminds me of a quote that I have to tell you, that maybe Dwight Eisenhower, it was, I think, who talked about strategy. And Eisenhower said, the plan is useless, but planning is essential. So, and there's a German general 100 years ago said, plans are wonderful until you meet the enemy, and then you throw them out the window because they just don't work when you're dealing with actual people and actual situations. So the point here, we can't solve a problem from the same state of consciousness that noticed it or created it. So it's a bit like if you're in a good mood and you come up with a good idea, it's very hard to hold on to that enthusiasm, because we're sort of programmed to be negative and to talk ourselves out of things. So if you've got a moment of inspiration and you immediately try to do something with it, then all sorts of negativity is going to enter the picture, and you're going to talk yourself out of it, or you're going to decide it's not worth doing. And then maybe later you'll regret it and you wish that you had tried it. So I'm saying, what would happen if we tried things at them and obeyed our own self, because we're the ones who come up with the idea. Sometimes it's in response to what we see in the world, but these moments when we come up with our own idea, or we realize something for ourselves, I think those are the ideas to develop. An example, I have this neighbor whose daughter's going to have a baby next February or March, and he's already imagining what's going to go wrong. He thinks he's quite positive and upbeat and optimistic, but actually he's thinking about this new baby, and all he's doing is imagining problems and reinforcing them every time he thinks about them. He's making it more of an obstacle. And I'm thinking, and then I wrote, don't do that, or don't do it that way. And this is when I remembered Glenn in The Walking Dead. Because somebody said to Glenn one time, why do you always imagine the worst, or the worst that can happen? And Glenn said, I imagine the worst that can happen, not because I'm expecting it, but so that I can prepare for it. So by all means, have your negative thoughts, but realize this is a negative thought. So this gives me the chance to figure out what I would do or what I could do if that particular situation were to develop. And then, like Vinny, the drummer, you forget about it and let it come back to you in its own time. Okay, we know how to add and subtract. This is a kind of change of direction here. So we know how to add and subtract, and we can always add and subtract anytime that we want, even if we're not thinking about adding and subtracting all the time. At the same time, we can't use up the addition and subtraction of things. It's like music. Everybody, you can play C major or some note or some chord. And if everybody on the planet played C major at the same time, it would still exist. And a week from now, you could play it again. It's not like you can use up C major or any other chord. And in the same way, addition and subtraction can't be used up. They're still there when we don't bother adding or subtracting. So there's something that we take for granted that we can't use up, that still exists invisibly when we're ignoring it. And so that made me wonder, where are these rules of arithmetic when they're not in use? Do you know what I mean? Like we don't add and subtract most of the time, but when we need them, they're there and they're available. But where are they when we're not using them or thinking about them? Which gets me into the idea of there being an invisible world. So then I thought, maybe where are they isn't the question, because they're not actually in a place, a physical place of space. So maybe where are the rules of they exist, obviously, and they're still there, and we can use them anytime we feel like it. So where are they? And then what else is with them? Which gets me to the tarot finally. Maybe the tarot is like arithmetic, that it just is, right? We can use it or not. And we don't have to use it. We don't have to add and subtract, but they're there available if we ever need them. Also, the rules of arithmetic are real but invisible. Maybe the tarot is also real but invisible. We have physical cards, but the actual working of the tarot is invisible. So rather than wonder if the tarot works or how it works, maybe remember arithmetic and be comforted by the fact that arithmetic works. Why wouldn't the tarot? Then the question is, where do our thoughts come from? So I wondered about this recently. Why does anybody think of anything? Because in a lot of ways, ideas come from within us. Sometimes we notice something in the outside world and we respond to it, right? So your thought is coming from, in a way, it's coming from outside, but it's your own reaction to that situation or that condition. So it sort of originates within you. And then the question is, what if we explore the thought or the idea, or try it and see where it leads and do more with it? And if we're enjoying it, keep doing more and developing it. If it's not quite right, then change it a little bit. And if we hate it, then stop doing it. But at least if we try something and we don't enjoy it, and we realize that we maybe 20 years ago we would have enjoyed it, but no longer, or not now, we've learned something and we can proceed doing what we want to do. And we know that we actually want to do it and living our own life, our own, and then I wrote down here, our own real life. Because how much of what you do and think and say and believe is actually the real you, and how much of it is just stuff you've picked up or that's been drummed into you. I'm remembering when I used to babysit my grandson, and he was like 4, and we'd go to a local park, and there were mothers there and nannies with babies or children and infants and strollers and so on. And honestly, you wouldn't, the main word that everybody used was don't. They had all these babies there, and 50 times in half an hour, they would tell them, don't do that, stop doing that, sit down, don't stand up, don't play with that. You know, it was like one instruction after another, and it was all negative. It was all stop doing that, don't do that. And so what does that do to people? It's not surprise really that you get to be 20 or 30 or 40 or more, and you're down on yourself, and you think that you can't do things, or you're not worthy, or you're not worth much. It's not surprising if you've had like 20 years of people telling you stop doing that, as if you didn't have a good reason for doing it in the first place. You know what I mean? So this is, I think, what started the whole thing. So um, your own real life, the invisible part of you. So the ideas that we have come from somewhere. Maybe they come from the invisible part of us, in the same way that the rules of arithmetic, or the ability to add and subtract, is invisible. In the same way that the tarot shows us things that are invisible. I remember ages ago reading somewhere about how the wind moving the branches of a tree shows the influence of the invisible, right? Because if a tree branch is moving, the invisible wind is making it happen. So you look at the tree, the branches moving, and you think it's just branches moving. Actually, it shows an invisible force acting on a visible object. Then I wrote down, we don't believe us. We don't generally do a lot with our ideas. We censor or talk ourselves out of it. What if we listen to ourselves and obey what we hear? Although then I thought, okay, maybe I've got the idea that I want to go and smash my neighbor's car windows. I'm not talking about, I may want to do it, but I'm not talking about doing that kind of violent, revengeful, cruel, vindictive behavior on other people who may or may not believe it, but that's not deserve it, but that's not the point. So I think when we have an idea, we explore it and examine it, and then if it needs to be tested, then we test it and see where it leads, and see what it leads to. And the thing is, what would our life look like if we actually paid attention to what we think, and paid attention to our ideas and examined them and found the good part of them and developed that good part of the idea? Would our lives be better? And the thing is, we can choose, and I get to that shortly with Gemini. So the other thing is, occurred to me, when a random thought comes to us, what do you, okay, this has to do with, I've got to do a backup, but I've got this microphone, and it's clamped to the desk. And there was one day I thought I should check that the screw thing is holding the clamp is still in place, because when you move the microphone around, it sort of makes the clamp come a little bit loose. And one time I didn't bother checking, and it fell off the table. So anyway, I had this momentary thought. I glanced at the microphone clamp and thought I should check that it's okay. But then I immediately thought, no, I'll do it later. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where you get this idea, and it'll only take seconds to do it. But instead of obeying yourself and just listening to yourself, you don't. You decide to do it later, or you put it on your to-do list. It only takes seconds. So what I did at that moment was I went round to the other side of the table and made sure that the clamp was still tight. So maybe I could have left it. I could have ignored it as I might normally do. But the fact that I obeyed myself, I'm obeying myself, but I'm also leaving order and orderliness behind me. And I'm preventing future problems just by taking the time to obey myself. So let's say you think I could do a backup, and then you think, no, I'll do it later. So probably your computer's going to be okay. But why not just, if you think I do the backup, just do it. If you've got 2 minutes, set it in motion. And then you've done a backup. And maybe what you're doing is you're training yourself or teaching yourself to develop good habits. Instead of being, I don't want to say lazy, but instead of ignoring yourself, which is really what's going on, I think, pay attention to yourself and see what other ideas, what bigger and better and more productive ideas come to you because you set the ball in motion, right? By me making myself go and check that the clamp was still tight, what have I set in motion for me? Because maybe in making sure that the clamp is orderly, in some other way, I'm introducing the idea of orderly behavior into my life, which means that other things that could have gone wrong are not going to go wrong because I'm paying attention. When you do something quickly, so the idea of checking the clamp or doing a backup, things like that take like a few seconds, and you can do it right now. And it's valuable because you're teaching yourself. I sometimes get ahead of what I'm thinking. You're teaching yourself good habits. If you listen to yourself, help lies within. Okay, it's easy to look for direction on the outside, right? So you ask somebody what to do or go to somebody for help. And it can be good, it can be useful, but maybe it's not personalized or it doesn't fit your actual and real nature, because good advice can be too generic, right? You know what I mean? Because I remember seeing it's like people tell other people what to do, but you realize they're really talking to themselves, and so I remember once on a TV show, I saw the psychologist telling, there was a woman who wanted to confront her boss. And the psychologist said, confront the boss and tell him you're unhappy. And I thought, if she does that, if the woman, because she was kind of meek and beaten up, metaphorically, so if she were to go and talk to the boss, if the boss yelled at her or barked at her or told her to get lost, she would just crumble. So it was good advice for somebody. Yes, confront your boss, but it wasn't good advice for that particular woman at that time, because the psychologist didn't say, do this and this and this to prepare so you can then confront the boss. He just assumed that she could do it, but she obviously couldn't. So that's what I mean about good advice can be too generic. It's because we tell other people what works for us, for our own self, but it's maybe not the right thing for these other people to do because they're built differently. And that's one of the things about astrology that is so useful, because with astrology, you don't expect, or you stop expecting other people to produce what they can't produce, because people are built differently. Okay, list your emotions. Okay, so when I used to teach at a local college, one of the exercises I did was I would say to the class, you've got 2 minutes to write down every emotion you can think of. So I'm going to suggest that you take 2 minutes now, pause the video, and write a piece of paper, write down every emotion you can think of, happy, sad, whatever it happens to be. So take 2 minutes and write it down, and then I'll come back. So assuming you're back, I bet most of what you wrote down isn't, if you look at the words you wrote down, I bet most of what you wrote down is negative. Because I found this in the class. I would end up writing the words on the board, and out of 30 words I would write up, 28 of them would be negative. People can more easily identify disappointment or sadness or unhappiness or fear or anger or hostility than they're aware of or can identify excitement, joy, happiness, fulfillment, satisfaction. So we seem to be programmed or biased in favor of the negative. So my neighbor, who seems to be a positive, upbeat person, right? There's going to be a newborn child. He's negative about it. He thinks he's being realistic, right? And yes, we have to take account of this might happen and that might happen. He isn't. All he's doing is creating problems for himself in the future. And I think that's what all of us do way too often, which is the point of this video. Write down what you're thinking and what ideas you have and what your emotional state is, and fix it. Procrastinating. What did I say for that? Thinking to yourself, no, I'll do it later, seems reasonable enough, but are you censoring yourself? Because, yeah, okay, so let's say I think for a moment, okay, I should check that the tension on the clamp for the microphone is still good enough. If I then, that thought came from somewhere, from the inner me, from the real me, from whatever it came from. If I then think to myself, no, I'll do it later, which part of me is overruling and controlling and censoring this other part of me? Because it's my thought. It wasn't motivated by anybody out there in the world. I just glanced at the arm in the microphone and thought I should check. But then if I decide, no, I'm not going to do it, or I'll do it later, who is that telling me? Which part of me is telling me no, or don't do that? Maybe the idea of tightening the clamp came from the inner me, or the greater self, or my unlimited mind. And so if I have this idea to tighten the clamp, or to check that the clamp is tight, and I say, no, I'll do it later, what's going on there? Which part of me is controlling or censoring which other part of me? And that's why I wrote down Gemini here. Okay, remember Castor and Pollux, right? The twins, the heavenly twins. Castor was mortal, Pollux was immortal. And we've all got Gemini in us somewhere. So it seems to me, my idea about checking the clamp is Pollux, the immortal mind, the immortal part of me that knows everything, that's sensible, that has got my best interests at heart and is looking out for me. So Pollux, my inner Pollux, says, check the clamp. My outer Castor, the human part that's lazy and has faults and has been bent out of shape by life, that's the part of me that says, I'll do it later. But really, we ought to listen to the eternal mind. Because which part of you, Castor or Pollux, is it the limited or the unlimited part of you gives you the ideas? And what happens if you follow through with what your eternal self tells you? And begin to identify when it's the eternal self speaking and when it's just the human part of you. I say just the human. Humans are great, but it's more like when it's the limited or finite or messed up or insecure part of you that's talking. And then I wrote down Scotiabank. So I had occasion to call my bank a while ago. And I get this recorded message saying we've got a greater than usual volume of calls at the moment, so your waiting time will be upwards of 20 minutes. So I dialed again and got the same message. So the next day I tried and it was upwards of 7 minutes. I thought, okay, I'll wait for a few minutes. And then when somebody eventually answered, he said, "How are you today?" And I said, "I was okay until I got your recorded message saying we have a greater than usual volume of calls today, so your waiting time will be more than 7 minutes." When what you mean is we don't hire that many people to answer the phone, so you're just going to have to wait. So the reason I'm telling you this is because to remind you, there's more than one way of describing things. There's more than one way of looking at something. So when you do a tarot reading for somebody and you say something, can it be understood only one way? I think that's the ideal. But if you say something and it can be understood in 10 different ways, that's not such a good tarot reading. I think ideally we train ourselves, or we're aware that I'm going to say this. I need to make sure that the questioner understands it the way I mean it, rather than just give them some kind of generic answer, a pat answer, and let them make of it what they will. Then I wrote teach yourself. It's easy to think we need teachers and mentors, and probably we do with things like learning Photoshop, right, or learning a language. But when it comes to living your own life, you can get ideas from other people, but it's up to you to implement them, or to live them out, or live through what the ideas are that you have. So yes, you can get information and help from other people, but in the end, it's up to you to do what you have to do. Live your own life. If we're going to live our own life, what do we need to know? I can't remember why I wrote here something to consider. Start with Castor and Pollux. Okay. I forget why I wrote this. So I seem to have stopped talking here. I'll be with you in a moment here. I can't remember what that was about, but Stevenson is a rocket. I'll tell you this. I actually meant to stop before here at live your own life. So let me at this point stop, because I can't remember what I was going to do with this next 2 bits. So if you have comments, it may be that the reason I'm doing this is not so much for right now, but maybe 6 months from now, I'll get comments or people will come up with ideas, and I'll be able to develop some of the points that I've made here. I don't actually know. So thank you for listening. I don't know how long this was, quite long, but hope you got something out of it, and I'll talk to you in a few days. Okay, bye-bye.